everybody, Mr. Hartman here, back again with the first video of Society Cold War, Section 3, Conflict Conciliation. And this video is going to go over the intro and then get into the role of the Central Intelligence Agency in American intervention in the 50s. So we talked about the Korean War in the last section, and that was the first time we saw the globalization of the Cold War. But not only that, it also shows that the bipolar world of the Cold War, the Soviets and the Americans, was really about to spread out to a lot of different places, right? It's going to get a lot more complicated. And so one of the key things that makes it more complicated is decolonization of the 50s and 60s. And so we see the Cold War reoriented. It moved away from Europe, specifically places like Berlin, and into places mostly in Asia with revolutions, civil wars, and proxy wars. Proxy wars being wars fought between sides that are sponsored by the United States and the Soviet Union, or in some cases China instead of the Soviet Union. And speaking of China, the rise of China and Cuba inspires a new wave of Marxist rebellion in lots of areas, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And that's going to kind of be the three regions that they keep focusing on in terms of communist insurrections, communist rebellions, and America's attempt to stop those. We also, during this section, will talk about the ideological divide growing between China and the Soviet Union, which really changes a lot of the kind of algebra, a lot of the math on the Cold War relationships, because the United States in particular tended to look at communism as one united front, right? Everybody that's a communist country in the world is focused and united together behind the Soviet Union. But the thawing of relations between China and the Soviet Union, which will eventually be called the Sino-Soviet split, leads to a lot of changing in thinking of that idea. And then we also have to kind of summarize here, right, the ideological clash between communism and liberal capitalism takes on a much more complex shape during this time period, especially as former colonized countries try to benefit from the superpower rivalry, while at the same time trying to make themselves independent, especially places like India and Egypt. We won't talk about India too much, but we will focus on Egypt at some point in this section. U.S.-Soviet relations are still kind of the main focus of international affairs. And what we start to see is that the U.S. is pretty okay. It starts to reconcile its major issue with their allies in Britain and France. Their main issue being that Britain and France are still massive colonial empires. Not for long, but they still are. And they're reconciling that with their democratic traditions and their anti-colonial traditions, right? The United States itself was a colony, of course. And so that tension will kind of come to the forefront here and there. But the key thing that we're really going to see here is that the United States throughout the Cold War is going to not be able to distinguish between anti-colonial nationalism, where we see in these former colonies or current colonies, we see this desire for nationalism. We see a desire for more of an individuality. That is going to be heavily construed and misconstrued with communism, right? They're going to see any independent movement from within a country to kind of step away from European influence as a step away from democracy and capitalist influence, the West's influence in general, and a step towards communism. And they're going to try to get rid of that wherever they can. And as they say here, they're going to back very unpopular and very authoritarian regimes in the name of anti-communism many, many times over. This is not a one-time thing at all. So let's start with the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and its part in American intervention during this era. And in fact, probably one of the defining features, if not the defining feature, of the Cold War strategy under Eisenhower was covert actions by the CIA. Which the thing that the reason the CIA is used more than anything is kind of twofold. And I think they get into this at some point. But number one, it is easy to keep this away from the public eye, right? It's easy to keep their covert or secret. You can kind of box those away into their own thing and not let the American public be aware of it. Secondly, it is also not under congressional surveillance, right, and or congressional approval for the most part. It's mostly under the executive branch. The CIA was created by Congress in 1947 to coordinate and streamline intelligence gathering, especially internationally. And it was part of Truman's broad-based national security initiatives. The CIA is kind of the equivalent to the FBI, where the FBI really focuses on domestic issues. The CIA focuses on international for the most part. And under Eisenhower, the CIA becomes the preferred instrument for intervention of Americans because Eisenhower not only was looking for kind of these covert operations for the reason we talked about, but also he was trying to really scale back the amount of money being spent on the Cold War, which is why we not only see the growth of the CIA, we also see the growth of nuclear arms in the United States. And that might seem interesting, might seem weird to think that nuclear arms are cheaper than conventional arms, but considering how many conventional arms, how many contracts we would have had to have beyond what we already did, it was cheaper. And here we have 302 operatives in 1949 and 2,812 just 3 years later in 1952. I'm going to get rid of one of those. I'll get rid of both of those and bring it back. There we go. Meanwhile, the budget went from $4.7 million in 1949 to $82 million in 1952. So those are pretty massive changes. You could probably say this is somewhere around a 9 times change. And here you're looking at somewhere around a 20 times change, right? And so, the CIA offers the president a way to wield American power discreetly, again, circumventing Congress, avoiding public scrutiny. And one high-ranking official would eventually say that the CIA had become a government within the government, right? They could evade oversight and they could draw that cloak of secrecy, basically confirming that nobody could touch them. And the desire to counter Soviet influence really trumped any concerns for Eisenhower or the Congress about the CIA's lack of transparency. And we have seen declassification of many CIA documents recently due to the idea that there's no reason for them to be secret anymore, which those covert operations began in earnest under Eisenhower. And the early CIA interventions follow a familiar pattern, and we're actually going to look at that pattern here in 3 different countries, where if a government was drifting towards the Soviet Union or towards Marxism or just appeared to be, officials would sound an alarm. And in Iran and Guatemala, we see the first CIA intervention in those countries where they overthrew democratically elected governments that were too pro-Soviet or simply not pro-American enough and installed U.S.-friendly regimes that were autocratic, right? Which is, it's unfortunate. It seems like an unfortunate coincidence that the regimes that the United States implemented were autocratic. But if you think of it this way, right, if they had ousted a democratically elected candidate and then allowed democratic elections to continue, they simply would have elected either that candidate again or a candidate of similar ideas. And so because of that, they couldn't let that happen. They had to have these autocrats take power. And so, as you see here, kind of a key theme, anti-communism will trump democratic ideals for the United States throughout the Cold War, leading to the U.S. backing many dictatorial governments. And we're going to start with Iran in 1953. So Iran, as it is today, economically and strategically important to the United States because it is an oil-rich nation that bordered the Soviet Union. And so in 1951, they elected a new prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. I hope I'm saying that right. I'm not sure if I am. And the key thing he focused on is nationalizing Iran's oil. And at that time, the oil in Iran was owned by Britain, the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which I would presume came about after World War I, where after World War I and the Ottomans were defeated, basically the French and the British carved up the Ottoman territories in the Middle East and called them mandates. They called them mandates. And so each of the countries, the British and the French, took control of the mandates. And their justification was, well, these countries aren't yet up to speed with the modern era, so we need to kind of just watch over them a little bit. One of those mandates, of course, would become Israel, because the British were kind of the early backers of getting Israel, the Jews, its own country in what is now Israel. And Iran was one of those countries as well. And so Mossadegh is a nationalist. He's not a communist, he's a nationalist. And he viewed foreign control of Iran's national resources as colonialism, and he rejected that. That it infringed on Iran's national sovereignty, which seems like a reasonable thing for anybody to think. And so we see tensions mount between Iran and Britain over this. And rumor has it Mossadegh was courting Soviet aid in the early months of 1953. Rumor has it. And so for two brothers in the American government, very powerful men in the American government, Mossadegh was very dangerous. Those two men are the brothers John Foster Dulles, who is the American Secretary of State at that time and the namesake of the school I teach at, and the CIA Director Allen Dulles. They believed that he needed to be removed from power because they didn't want him to join the Soviet side, and Eisenhower agreed with them. And so in mid-June of 1953, they give the green light to a CIA-backed coup known as Operation Ajax. And so the things that the CIA did, first off, is they undermined Mossadegh's rule by bribing local officials to be against him, by disseminating propaganda against him, by organizing protests against him, and then arming anti-government forces against him. And by just a few months later, right, so this didn't take long, this took about 2 months. By the end of August of 1953, Mossadegh had been ousted and replaced by the pro-American Shah Reza Pahlavi. And so the coup ends up being a double success for the United States. Not only do they save Iran from joining the Soviet sphere, but also it gave American corporations access to Iranian oil, which, if you know anything about American foreign policy and oil, this will be an ongoing theme later on. However, in the long run, this is a really, really bad decision. Because this leads to this damages the reputation of the Americans among the Iranians, who, at this point were kind of just, either A, another country, or B, respected as a superpower. But the key thing it's going to do is it's going to sow the seeds for the Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1979, which kind of culminates with the taking of hostages in the American embassy for over a year. Which is basically going to end Jimmy Carter's presidency. Then we have Guatemala in 1954. Jacobo Arbenz is elected in 1950 in Guatemala as president. I believe he's president, not prime minister. He is a populist. He is populist and left-leaning, which those two things to the Americans shout he is a communist, which created a lot of anxiety in those U.S. foreign policy circles. They believed he would easily be able to make his way into the Soviet camp. Because they shared similar ideas. And one of the key ideas he had is dramatic land reforms, because 2.5% of Guatemalans controlled 70% of all the nation's farmable land, arable land, they said, but arable means able to be farmed. And so he begins to expropriate uncultivated land, including hundreds of thousands of acres owned by an American company, the United Fruit Company. And so back to the Dulles brothers, they were worried that Arbenz's land redistribution was the beginning of a communist government, right? On the side, by the way, the Dulles brothers apparently had very close ties to the United Fruit Company. But that's not what's important here. What's important is that they were worried that communism would spread throughout Central America, and that the disease of communism demanded an active response. Which, by the way, if you kind of line this up, with the Iranian and takeover by Shah Reza Pahlavi, you see American corporations get access to their oil there. We see American corporations' interests being protected in Guatemala. Seems a little fishy, huh? And so Eisenhower endorses a CIA-led military coup in Guatemala known as Operation PBSUCCESS. And what they did in PBSUCCESS is they trained rebel forces. They would ran a radio station that broadcasted propaganda. And even when the military junta was successful, they escorted that junta into the capital. The junta is basically a military government, right? This forces Arbenz to flee the country, and he resigned from office in June of 1954. So we see Alan Dulles and other Cold Warriors celebrate the liberation of Guatemala from communism, even though the intelligence reports they had in Guatemala is that there was no connection between Arbenz and the Soviets. The Guatemalan people themselves were not better off at all. This led to decades of military rule and brutal civil war within Guatemala, which destabilized and devastated the country economically. But again, U.S. intervention achieves its immediate objective in Guatemala by making sure communism doesn't become a thing there. But again, long-standing, long-term issues where we see long-standing resentment against the United States and Latin America. And ironically, the anti-American feeling in Latin America will help future communist revolutions, especially one that was successful in Cuba. For Eisenhower, kind of on the whole with these two, success in Iran and Guatemala affirms his commitment to CIA intervention because it was cost-effective Cold War strategy, and it was proving dividends at the time. But this leads to overconfidence in covert operations in its ability to achieve foreign policy objectives, which will come back to bite the United States later on in the Cold War. Lastly, we have Vietnam, also in 1954, and this one's a little bit more complicated. So Vietnam has a long history of foreign domination. In ancient times, which is not quite accurate as a world history teacher. Ancient times is way ago, but whatever. We're talking like I think around, you want to say probably 600s, 500 CE up until somewhere around 1700s or so. China had been in and out of Vietnam. And then in the late 19th century, France colonized Vietnam as part of the larger global spread out from the Indian Ocean and the Americas to kind of get the rest of the world that they could. And during World War II, of course, the Japanese military occupied French Indochina, subjecting its people to harsh rule. And French Indochina includes Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. I believe that's all it might be a little bit more than that. I'm not sure. Following the liberation of Vietnam from Japan after World War II, or during World War II in 1945, communist leader Ho Chi Minh renewed his call for independence. And they say renewed because he had already asked for this at the Paris Peace Conference, the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919. He even quoted Thomas Jefferson in his appeal to the Americans. And so he thought he might have a chance here because Truman had supported Ho's fight against Japanese occupation. He was the leader of the front against Japanese occupation. However, it's kind of stuck between support for a newly independent nation that could be communist versus supporting their French allies. Truman backed his French allies and doubled down on the American support of French colonialism in Southeast Asia. And again, it kind of goes back to talking about Woodrow Wilson's rejection of Ho's first petition for Vietnamese self-determination after the Versailles / Paris Peace Conference, which nobody got self-determination into the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, despite what Woodrow Wilson said he wanted. Whatever. Ho Chi Minh was different from Mossadegh and Arbenz, Mossadegh and Arbenz's connections to communism were either very thin or non-existent. Ho Chi Minh was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. He had studied in Moscow at the Communist University for the Toilers of the East in the 30s. That is the name of the university, by the way, the Communist University for the Toilers in the East. What a name. And so Ho Chi Minh embraced armed struggle to oust the French. And so to help the French without directly intervening, because we know Eisenhower was very much against that, Eisenhower puts billions of dollars into propping up French rule in Vietnam. But the Soviet Union and China on the other side recognized Ho's provisional government as the official government, and they would provide military training, aid, and support to his Viet Minh fighters, that is the name of the soldiers, for Ho Chi Minh's resistance. And by 1954, the U.S. was paying for 80% of the war, even though they weren't really involved. And 1954 is also the same year that the French surrender at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Now, Eisenhower, again, really didn't want to send American troops at all. And so because of this, the defeated French were forced to accept Vietnamese independence. And in 1954, we had peace negotiations at the Geneva Conference, which created a temporary partition of the nation at the 17th parallel, very similar to what happened in Korea. And a key component of the Geneva Accords were national elections set for 1956 to create an independent and unified Vietnam. So they were going to do the 17th parallel for a few years, and then they were going to unify Vietnam with these elections. However, the Americans were very worried that the communists would win the election. And so because of this, the Americans basically made sure that those elections never took place, which created a permanent partition. And that permanent partition led to the Republic of Vietnam in the South, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, who was an anti-communist and a Catholic. So this all lined up very well for the United States, who had succeeded the Emperor Bao Dai. And then the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, which is ruled by Ho Chi Minh's Communist Party, with again support from the Soviet Union and China. And so fear of communist takeover of South Vietnam led Eisenhower to send them aid in terms of money, military supplies, and CIA advisors, hoping to bolster the authoritarian Diem government. However, this covert intervention in Vietnam will eventually lead to full-scale war in that country, which will be one of the worst wars in American history, and leave a massive mark on the 60s and early 70s. Also, the other thing about Ngo Dinh Diem's government is they're very corrupt. He essentially, Ngo Dinh Diem had these fake elections occur where he won the election and stuff like that all the time. It was ridiculous. But anyways, that's going to do it for this first video on section 3. The next one we'll talk about the non-alignment group, as well as the Middle East and the New World Order that kind of comes out of all this. But thank you guys so much for watching, and until the next time, I will see you in the next